Lots to talk about this afternoon because the world continues to spin out of control. At least it seems that way. We're going to create a little order to start off with a guest. We have Alexander William Salter here. He teaches economics at Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. The thesis is that tariffs don't benefit manufacturing workers. Alexander, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Do we call you Alexander or Alex or Professor, or what do you like?
Alex is fine.
Okay. Tell us about tariffs. Do tariffs always exist, or do they have waves of interest? What's the history of tariffs?
Well, I don't think there's ever been anything like completely free trade in the history of the United States, but there definitely have been higher trade barriers than there are now. The reason it's come back into the popular imagination is that you have many people now on the right claiming that if we create barriers to international trade by erecting tariffs, taxes on imports, we can benefit domestic manufacturing workers. And to be perfectly frank, I think that if you look at the economics of that, it doesn't hold up.
And this is because the costs just move elsewhere? Is that why?
Well, when you look at how domestic manufacturing firms actually act, what they choose to do when the price of imports go up, right? The price of steel went up when President Trump imposed steel tariffs, for example. What foreign manufacturing firms do is they, of course, substitute relatively more domestically produced steel because that's now relatively cheaper. But since their costs are going higher, they scale back on how much labor they use. And so if they're scaling back on how much labor they use, that's obviously not going to be great for workers. It's also worth pointing out that it is technically possible that firms could cope with higher steel costs by actually expanding the volume of output. So they try and spread those larger costs over a wider range of output. And so if that happens, it might be the case that firms will actually use more labor. But when you look at the economic assumptions that make that feasible, it's virtually impossible. It's not going to be something that we see in reality. We can be safe with the typical economic conclusion that when you make producing things costlier, you're going to use less inputs, including labor, which means fewer labor hours worked, and workers are probably going to take home less take-home pay.
In other words, if government steps in and creates artificial impediments to profit and doing business, like by artificially raising prices of certain goods, then what a business does is adjusts to try to reduce costs elsewhere so that it can maintain its price competitiveness. Is that fair?
Sure. Businesses are always going to try and profit maximize. That's why they're in business. What they're going to do is respond as best they can to the prices that they observe, and the question then becomes, okay, if an input like steel gets more expensive, how is that going to affect labor? And we too easily assume that if domestic steel gets comparatively cheaper because of a tariff, that's good for labor. It isn't, because all those American manufacturing firms use steel as an input, which makes production in general costlier and therefore harder.
And that puts pressure on wages and the opportunity to work even. So
that's right.
This is, I think, classic politics where you propose a policy, you sell a benefit, and there's no full-throated conversation that takes place where you actually compare both sides of the ledger. What are the costs to the benefit that you're going to provide, Mr. Politician? That doesn't get offered. They don't offer that. They don't say, we've looked at this side of the equation and that side of the equation, and we see where there's a little gap there where we can make a little money for Americans if we do this. They just sell the benefits like there are no costs.
It is part of the art of politics to ignore either one side of the ledger. Either you ignore the benefits or you ignore the costs when either one of them is politically inconvenient to you. Now, I want to be clear. Just because tariffs do not benefit domestic workers does not mean that there is no possible good argument for tariffs. You have to also take into consideration national security. You have to also take into consideration maybe wanting to reshore some of the domestic manufacturing base for the purposes of producing crucial goods for the purposes of national defense. There are obvious reasons why we don't want hostile or enemy nations producing a lot of those goods that we use to protect ourselves. But that's a totally different argument, and we do have to face up to the reality that even if there are good national security exceptions here, we're going to pay an economic cost for it. But as you noted, the politicians never like to talk about the cost. It's all benefit, benefit, benefit. It's a free lunch. Well, nothing in economics is a free lunch.
So the President Trump is talking about 60% tariffs on China. Can you break that down for us?
It's a pretty steep number. I understand the logic of wanting to work toward disentangling the U.S. economy with the Chinese economy, and I think that it is a perfectly valid policy consideration to have selective tariffs on hostile nations and maybe even selective capital controls on hostile nations. The goal would be not necessarily to repatriate a lot of U.S. manufacturing, but at least give U.S. firms an incentive to shift production maybe to elsewhere in Southeast Asia, perhaps Vietnam or Thailand, to regimes that are more friendly and compatible with U.S. national interests. It has to be done delicately, though, because so much of our economy is wrapped up with China now that if we do this too bluntly and too suddenly, the economic costs are going to be just a huge shock, and it's going to be very difficult for domestic manufacturers and other producers to actually adapt to that. There are valid national security considerations again, but this is something that has to be done deftly, and I worry that President Trump's approach is just a little bit too blunt.
Well, at least the rhetoric is blunt, and it sounds like what you're saying is it also creates pressure on the manufacturers, because if American companies have plants over there, and the point of a tariff is to get them to move elsewhere, then they're going to suffer the effects of those tariffs. So the punishment the tariffs mete out spreads around maybe to places you don't want it to.
The costs are always going to spill over. You can never isolate the economic damage. The best you can hope for is you have a reasoned deliberation over what the total costs and benefits of the policy are and hope that we're getting more than we're losing. Does that mean somebody's going to get hurt in the short run? Almost certainly. That's true of any economic change. We just need to find a way of making sure that A, what we're paying is worth it, and B, we're actually getting the intended results of the policy. Far too often we let intentions rather than results guide our policy deliberations, and that's the exact opposite of what an economically informed policy paradigm says we should do.
We're talking to Alex Salter from Rawls College at Texas Tech University. And this point you're just making, as I observe government domestically, making domestic policy that affects business, when they step into zones I feel like they don't belong in, like minimum wage, for example, what they seem to do, or student loans, for maybe a more poignant example that everybody can relate to, they tend to make messes. And I wonder if the messes that they make when they're dealing with tariffs are as bad as the student loan type messes.
In various times and places, I think they can be. There's definitely an element to whack-a-mole to all of this, right? You think that you solved a problem, you implement the policy, 3 new problems sprout up, the public demands that you do something, so you pass another policy, but now 5 problems spout up because all those interventions didn't actually do what you wanted them to do. What the government is especially good at is restricting supply and boosting demand through subsidies. The one thing that we know, wherever that's tried, student loans, for example, is that's going to boost prices. That's going to make the thing more expensive. And then we have these years, if not decades, of failed policies that all they do is make crucial goods and services more expensive. And we ask, what went wrong? Well, the whole enterprise was misguided from the beginning. It didn't rely on a clear assessment of the costs and benefits.
So how about philosophically, how would you suggest to people that they approach this? Because my instinct, again, would be more libertarian and would say politicians are a disaster when they make policy, especially when they intervene in the running of businesses that they know nothing about. So let's just have a minimalist approach, and that we as voters should have a default stance of no, don't do it. Mind your business, even tariffs. Is there any compelling argument you make on tariffs that we need them so badly that we can't have a philosophy like that?
I think our default should be, as you said, for prudential reasons, that the national government has a very high burden of proof before it gets involved in anything economically that looks like picking winners and losers. It's easy to sit down and spin out a tale about why a particular tariff might be optimal or in the national interest. The question is, does that first best policy proposal survive contact with the actual political process where there are ravenous interest groups all looking to carve off a slice for themselves? Almost always the answer is no. Almost always the answer is no. And so you need to have a compelling public purpose, first of all. And second of all, you need to have strong reasons to suppose that a policy is actually going to do what you want it to do. Too often we look at the number of jobs saved by a tariff, and then we realize when you crunch the numbers, but each one of those jobs cost the taxpayer somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000. There was really no other use of those funds that could have better secured the national interest in some other way. You got to be kidding me. So I think that you're right, and that we should assume, unless that burden of proof could be met, that we don't want the government that is most distant from the citizens, the national government, which is only supposed to act in the crucial national interest, to meddle with markets, because that just opens up the political process to the hog feeding place where the special interests are going to come and basically dissipate any of the benefits that you might get from that.
We're talking to Alex Salter. He teaches economics at the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech. Can you hold for a moment? I want to ask you about EVs, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
WTIC, we're talking about tariffs. Donald Trump likes them, but Joe Biden likes them too. And we're turning to Alexander Salter. He teaches economics at Texas Tech University, the Rawls School of Business. We thank you once again for being here, Alex. So EVs are one of these areas that the American government thinks is an answer to climate change, but we don't really have the supply chain worked out as well as the Chinese do. Alex, how does that leave us, and what would tariffs do in this case?
I can understand why people would want to try and make sure that we have more of that supply chain domestically secured. Dealing with international politics, especially with China, is particularly difficult because the relationship of the Chinese private sector, such as it is, to their government is not anything like the relationship of the American private sector to its government. There is a meaningful private sector in the United States. There are private property rights. There's a rule of law. Increasingly in China, private property simply means agglomerations of capital that the Chinese Communist Party hasn't seen fit to seize yet. So you got to worry if that's going to be one of your major trading partners, no matter what you're sourcing. So if you're making electric vehicles and most of your parts, most of your components are coming from China, you do have to worry, is that secure? So you can understand the theoretical argument for maybe encouraging more domestic manufacturing with tariffs, but then you have to confront head on the interest group problems. You can't assume these away. All these benefits that you're proposing to create for domestic manufacturers are going to be competed for by interest groups. And that could very well actually undermine your purpose of securing the supply chain. It's kind of like a catch-22, but sometimes there are no easy answers.
Well, we know that the best results come from a marketplace making decisions where consumers get to decide what the answer to issues are. And that's what builds a good supply chain. We saw this during COVID, that when government came in and crushed the supply chain, we got to see how delicate and intricate it was, the kind of thing that could only be devised through a long period of natural evolution of the marketplace. And the idea of government stepping in and wanting to affect certain aspects of that market just seems to me to be creepy in terms of how dangerous it is for what it could do to a market. Aren't we better off if we just say, look, China's got an advantage here. Let's go compete with them like only we can do?
That would be the default, I think. Again, you have to worry, though, that in trading with China, you might be actually sowing the seeds of future conflicts or future problems. You have to worry about, for example, enriching somebody when that person that you're trading with is an adversary that could very well use the wealth that's created by trading with them in a way to harm your national interest in the future.
Well, we blew that one a long time ago with China, didn't we?
Yeah, it sort of seems that ship has sailed, but just because you shot yourself in the foot yesterday doesn't mean you have to do it again tomorrow.
No, but this could be a new form of shooting in the foot. So maybe we could look at it and say the Chinese have a head start on EVs. Maybe we should focus on something other than EVs, like hydrogen or some other option, hybrid cars, which are being produced for 20 years now by some of the best manufacturers in the world. Why don't we go in another direction?
There are strong arguments that say that we should do that. You're talking about the economic idea of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage simply means we should specialize in that line of production that we can actually perform best in. what are we best at in terms of all these outcomes, right? What actually minimizes the value of the resources that we're using to produce? If it's not EVs, it's probably going to be something else. We're probably going to be able to find something else to specialize in and trade. And it might be the case that at the end of the day, the Econ 101 textbook answer is the right answer. It frequently is, actually.
Econ 101 being the basics of what drives markets.
I think so. I think that at the end of the day, the stories that we tell, supply and demand, prices, quantities, how taxes work, how subsidies work, all this basic bread and butter economics still is the most powerful perspective we've yet devised that tells us about how markets work. And that's particularly important for a commercial republic like the United States. Our commercial system is the foundation of our power and prosperity. And if we don't understand it, using the tools of economics, we're not going to put ourselves in a good position to be responsible citizens deliberating the courses of policy in the future.
What kind of attitude do your students take towards this kind of policy?
My students are very practical. The thing that they like doing more than anything else is rolling up their sleeves and solving problems. So what I think they particularly like about my classes is that I'm not at all interested in just telling them what policy proposals they should or shouldn't like. Mm-hmm. I'm perfectly happy if they can use the tools of economics to say, okay, you want to tax this thing? Here are the costs and benefits. Okay, you want to subsidize that thing? Here are the costs and benefits. And two people can look at the situation and have different value judgments about whether, for example, a tariff on imported steel is a good thing, but they should at least agree on the economics of it. They should be able to both look at that problem situation and say, I'm using supply and demand, and that tells me that the costs and benefits are X and Y. Now we got to make a judgment. Now we got to make a call about whether it's worth it or not.
It sounds like good stuff.
My students like it. I like doing it, and I'm very happy to be at Texas Tech where they let me keep on doing it.
Well, Alex, it's great to meet you. It was fun to talk. Alexander Salter, he's an economics professor at Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University at the Free Market Institute there, and it's good to get your insights. Thank you, Alex, for taking the time.
Thank you.
All righty, take care. So there you have a little perspective of a free marketeer, which matches up pretty well with us, doesn't it? Let's pause for news and we can talk more about it. Coming up on WTIC.